Welcome to Pop Psych 101
where we, licensed therapist Ryan Engelstad,
and licensed psychologist Dr. Hayley Roberts
break down and analyze how mental health is represented in movies, shows, books, and across the pop culture and social media landscape.
We will determine what lines up with real life and what is just pop culture fantasy.
This is Pop Psych 101. Welcome back to Pop Psych 101. I am licensed therapist Ryan Engelstad, here as always with my co-host, Dr. Hayley Roberts.
Hello.
Welcome back, Hayley. I feel like I need a laugh track or something to kind of get us in the mood for this slightly different episode.
Yes. You just need a
or a
catchy
theme song. Yeah. Yeah, because today we are going to be diving into a classic 2000s sitcom, and that will be How I Met Your Mother.
Yeah, classic that did not hold up.
Right. Oh my gosh. Well, we're going to talk about all that. But specifically, we're going to be talking about a relevant to us character arc or plot arc. And that is, it's basically season 7, but specifically the relationship between Robin and her therapist, Kevin. So we have a whole lot of thoughts about their relationship and how Kevin is portrayed as a therapist and as a character on the show, which we are going to get into all of that stuff after the break.
Yeah.
But first, one of the sort of ongoing gags in How I Met Your Mother in general, and in this season specifically, is like the gang just loves Halloween. And even though it's springtime here for us, it made me kind of reminisce about my own Halloween experiences. And I'm sure you've got good ones as well, because we see the gang kind of reminisce, especially Ted and Marshall and Lily, because they always have sort of like a three-way combined group costume. Did you ever do anything like that, like group coordinated costumes? I feel like that's a very specific thing.
I have not done that, but I have a very funny story about a group costume. So one time I was going to a party with friends, and they were a couple, and then they had a third friend, and the three of them were going as the 3 blind mice.
Nice.
But the third person in their group was showing up later, and I also happened to just throw a costume together, and I was Minnie Mouse. And so I show up at their house, and the 2 of them are blind mice, and I'm Minnie Mouse. And we were like, this is so funny. Like, we're all mice. But the 3 of us are showing up at a party together, and their third blind mouse is not. So when we show up at this party, they walk in, and then everybody's like, oh, funny, 2 blind mice. And then they see my ears and they go, 3 blind mice. And then they look at me and I go, I misunderstood. I was like, I got the wrong mouse. And everybody was like, oh, well, you guys, this is fine. And then later when the third blind mouse showed up, everyone was like, wait a minute. And they were like, yeah, no, Hayley was messing with you. She's not a part of our costume. But that was just like really weirdly coincidental. And it was just so funny because everybody at the party was like, some people were like, oh my gosh, that's hilarious. You guys clearly planned this. And other people were like feeling bad for me. And it was just so funny because I wasn't even a part of their costume. It was just a weird coincidence.
That's great. I love those kind of things where, yeah, just because like who, because then that's like a running joke for years, probably. Yeah.
Yeah. Super funny. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, Halloween's one of my favorite holidays, now that my daughter is old enough to like pick out her costume. Like she always wants us to dress up with her. So our costumes are now all coordinated.
Fun.
So this most recent Halloween, we went as like characters from the Descendants movies, which if you're not familiar.
I'm super familiar.
Yeah, so for those of you who might not be familiar, The Descendants is like a Disney Channel movie series where like all the classic Disney villains had kids, and then those kids like go to school together and hijinks ensue. So my daughter was one of those characters. I was, so she was the daughter of Maleficent. Mal is her name.
Kind of the main character.
And I, of course, had to be Mal's father, who is Hades. So I got to be Hades. And
That's
then, of
fun.
course, my wife didn't have to be Maleficent, Mal's mom. She got to be Mal's best friend,
Oh, lucky
which tells you
mom.
everything you need to know about our, our family dynamic.
That's so funny.
And so that was a lot of fun. The other one we did, I guess that was 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, was Pokemon themed. She was Eevee. I was
Oh, cute.
Ash, and my wife was Misty. So that was a lot of
Okay.
fun.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And then, as a kid, I mean, the most memorable one is me and my friends all going as the Spice Girls, which
Oh,
feels like a
fun.
very How I Met Your Mother type
Oh, yeah.
joke that I wouldn't
Totally.
do as a kid now.
Mhm. Totally.
So yeah, I love all that stuff.
That always makes me think of Kristen Bell, obviously, is the voice of Anna in Frozen, but her daughter for a few
Yes.
years made her dress up as Elsa.
Right.
And it's so the daughter dressed up as Elsa and then also required Kristen Bell to dress up as Elsa, and the photo of
Naturally.
Kristen just being, like, peeved about it is so funny to me, and I love it so much. She's like, "I'm literally Anna, like, you're gonna make me Elsa?" So funny, though.
Yeah, but she doesn't have to ask for much. I'm always very eager to
Yeah.
go to the Halloween store and get whatever ridiculous stuff because it's fun.
Oh,
How
yeah, way
often do you
fun.
get to do that kind of stuff?
Totally.
Yeah. So we have a lot of goofy pictures, just like Ted has amassed of all his group costumes with.
Next year, you guys can go as Salt and Pepper and Cumin.
Yeah,
A reference to the one of the episodes.
yes, of course. I think Bryn usually has grander designs than that, but yeah, we could probably pull that off too.
That's so funny.
Yeah, so it's nice to have little kind of group in jokes, and that's one thing that How I Met Your Mother does very well. And we're going to get into some of those in jokes and all the sort of trials and tribulations of Robin and her boyfriend slash therapist Kevin right after this break. Hey everyone, Ryan here. No ad this week, but a quick request. We would love to know where you follow us, so if you wouldn't mind taking 10 seconds while you're listening to today's episode, reach out to us on your social media of choice. Say hi, say what's up, request an episode topic. We would love to hear from you. And now, back to the episode. Pop Psych 101 discusses mental health as it is portrayed in pop culture media, and because of this, we often cover sensitive topics that can be triggering for some listeners.
We also delve into the characters and plots of these stories, and therefore, spoilers abound.
So please, use your discretion as you listen to the rest of the episode. How I Met Your Mother is an American sitcom created by Craig Thomas and Carter Bays for CBS. The series follows the main character, Ted, and his group of friends in New York City. Ted, throughout the series, is obviously recounting to his kids how he met their mother. But we are focusing on season 7, starting with episode 4, the Stinson Missile Crisis. And in this episode and sort of the remainder of the season, we are focusing on Robin Scherbatsky, who has been mandated to therapy after assaulting a woman on the streets of New York City, which we find out because she is sort of meddling in Barney's relationship. So, Hayley, you and I were talking before we started recording about how the sort of like reasoning for a character to go into therapy, especially in a sitcom, is, often convoluted. It's never just like a normal thing like, oh, yeah, I've been struggling. I just, thought it would be a good thing for me. It's always got to be some kind of crazy, twisted plot device.
Yeah, and nobody ever chooses it for themselves. Like, nobody is ever like, I would really like to work with a therapist. It's always either court mandated, like it is for Robin, or in some other series we've watched, their families have forced them into it, or their employees have forced them into it, or whatever. It's never just somebody like, I think I'd like somebody to talk this through with. And yeah, the way that they talk about it, particularly on How I Met Your Mother, is a lot of like, oh boy, super embarrassing that she has a therapist. And there's one intro for I think the second episode of her being in therapy where they're like, so it was 2011 and Aunt Robin was in therapy and it was actually going well. And it was like,
Yeah.
okay, like shocking.
Yeah, and so we get this sort of very stereotypical, especially like New York City therapist, right? Oh, Harvard, Princeton, Harvard,
Hmm.
and in this very fancy office with very interesting decorations, kind of like fancy horse heads, tattoos, and so they set up this character of Kevin, and Robin is. I think the one thing I did like about this initial thing is that she does this sort of very stereotypical thing where it's like, I don't need to be here. I don't
Hmm.
like this is crazy. Like, let me just talk about my friends. Because I do think for a lot of people, especially people in mandated circumstances, like, I'd rather talk about anything but the reason why I'm here.
Hmm. Yeah.
So she does a pretty good job of that.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think the first kind of few bits of her being in therapy are actually a humorous but accurate representation of therapy
Yes, agreed.
because she will go off on these tangents, which interestingly enough, as you watch the rest of the season, that's how the episodes actually go as well. So it's funny that that's kind of how they mirrored that with her therapy session. But the therapist, Kevin, does a really good job of letting her know that she's doing that. And he's like, you've gone off about your friends again. Like, how about we bring it back to what brings you here? And she like did had some insight and he was like, exactly, let's dive into those feelings instead of
Yes.
going off about friends or whatever. And she's like, oh right, my friends.
Yep.
But yeah, so in the beginning it was like really, it was going really well. And there was one point where she said, and then I said, blah, 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 blah. And it was like this really like therapeutic response. And he was like, all right, no, like, what did you really say though? Which, if you have a good rapport with somebody, which ultimately, obviously, they do have a good rapport, I think you are able to kind of be playful like that and call people out in that kind of direct but meaningful way. But then things just go off the rails.
Yeah, and I think one of the things is that, especially an initial therapeutic relationship, like Robin is sort of trying to come across as a good person and
Yeah.
and maybe even impress him, which I think is, whether it's mandated or not, I think a lot of people hesitate to kind of go into the deep, dark, painful, uncomfortable stuff.
Hmm.
And it's a natural response to, when someone is asking you questions about yourself, maybe to kind of minimize the extent of how difficult things are because it's whether it's fear of judgment. I mean, especially for someone in a first therapeutic experience, naturally, even if they've been dealing with difficult things, they want to feel good about like the story that they're telling, right? And Robin definitely does that consistently.
Yeah. And I mean, she does it by very rarely having herself be a main character. It's always like, listen to what everybody else was doing. And then when she does interject what she's doing, again, it's this like glorified therapeutic response that she gave, which
Right.
he's like, that's not what you said. But I definitely think kind of what you were saying about somebody wanting to be really liked by their therapist, I think that that's typical and makes sense. It's hard to feel comfortable sharing your soul when the person you're sharing with, you don't have at least a general understanding, or as we would call it, a general rapport.
Yeah, and like you said before, Kevin tries to go deeper with her, and I think again we kind of have these sort of natural instincts of even though she knows why she's in therapy and she knows that Kevin is kind of getting close to the reasons, the painful, uncomfortable stuff.
Hmm.
We have this sort of natural tendency to well, I'd rather talk about this. And
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I mean, sometimes that's a session by session trend for
Uh-huh.
people
Yep.
where it's like, it takes 10, 15, 20 minutes into the session to kind of get into the real work, right?
Hmm.
Because it's easy initially, especially to, oh, well, this is how the past week has been and this is what's going on at work and these are the crazy things my kids did. And not that
Hmm.
there's anything wrong, right, with talking about those things, but and I guess maybe that's I'm curious sort of how you handle that because Kevin does I think try to redirect, essentially call her out, that she is not really talking about the reason that she's there. So how do you handle that? Let's say if someone is obviously avoiding the content or the work that maybe would most benefit them.
Yeah, I think Robin only had 2 sessions, so I would let her
Sure.
talk about her friends.
Of course, of course.
He at one point says something like, "Oh, you were afraid that this would happen in the same way that like your boss dismissed you in the same way that Barney dismissed you," or
Yes,
something
yes. So
like
he's
that.
drawing connections for her.
Yeah, I would make comments like that. So I would, start connecting their stories together. I would start giving these like therapeutic insights. And then I would ask the question that would let them get deeper into that, right? And instead of saying like, "Oh, let's get deeper into that." Although sometimes I do say that. Like sometimes I'm like, "Oh, hold on. You just said something really powerful there. Do we want to go there? Do we want to
Mm-hmm.
explore that a little bit more?" But if somebody's as resistant and guarded as Robin is, and as somebody who watched the whole season or the whole series, she doesn't get vulnerable and she is a very guarded person. I think you would have to spend a lot of time simply letting her use those walls as she needs them until she feels that she can like let them down, and it would be a lot of just like these little comments, these little connections, rather than busting through them.
Right, right. Because if you push too hard, then that's where the walls come back up, right? And
Yeah.
that's the balance that we as the therapists have to help our patients find, where
Mhm.
of course you can come in and talk about how the past week has been and start with sort of surface level things. Not necessarily our job to force people to confront their deepest darkest things once a week, but to your point, being able to kind of pull or tease out trends, patterns, things that we're noticing, to just kind of check in on whether it be like the patient's goal for like why they're coming in to talk today,
Mhm.
or sort of more generally like, hey, I'm noticing that you're doing this. Like, is that something that you're concerned about? Do we want to address that, or are you happy just kind of using our time to talk about this today, right? Because we don't
Mhm.
necessarily have to force anything else either.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll frequently check in with goals if that kind of surface level conversation happens for a long time, I'll kind of check in and say, is this a place where you just want to check in week to week? Is it just, somewhere where you want space to just kind of be able to unwind? And if that's the case, great. Um, or is this the place that you want to kind of explore your personal journey a little bit more? And if so, how do you and I make that happen? And kind of work with the person to figure out like, do you want me to call you out when you're doing it? Do you want me to let it
Right.
happen? Do you like what? And most people, when I have those conversations, if that is the direction they want to go, usually say, like, yeah, like I want you to point it out when it's happening. And then usually what happens is I'm like, "You're doing the thing again." And they're like, "Oh my God, I
Yeah.
am doing,"
Yeah.
it usually becomes like a
Yeah.
playful in the way that I do therapy,
Yep.
because
For
I
sure.
do therapy in a very playful way. And so I'm like, interesting. What do you think you did there?
Yep.
And people usually are like, I did. Yeah, Robin's just a tough, I mean, she's a tough character. So I think she'd be a tough character in therapy. I think the show makes it wild because she explicitly only has 2 sessions, but like the rapport and the engagement and the discussion that they're having in the second one is just unheard of. Like they're just like
Right.
they have this like good banter, and he when he says I can no longer work with you, she's like, "Oh, like because I have a fear of abandonment, what, you're going to abandon me now? Haha." And I'm like, "Okay, you guys could not have gotten from the first session to her being hyper aware of her fear of abandonment and the role that his presence plays in that, like it was super interesting the way they kind of like fast forwarded that so that they could get through the plot point.
Right. And I guess and we can fast forward along with them, right? Because that's the sort of whiplash that we experience from session 1 to 2 to
Mhm.
then dating, basically,
Yep.
is that's how quickly they get into a relationship. So I thought it'd be useful to kind of look at how they portray that transition, right? So whether it's implied that maybe there were more sessions in between and this relationship has built up or not.
No, they explicitly say that she only gave him 2 hours of vulnerability.
Well, you're exactly right. So
Yeah,
yeah, so that was their second and only other session.
yeah.
So Kevin makes up the excuse that he's like going to
Moving to
Alaska, I think,
Alaska,
right?
yeah. Sorry,
Yes.
gotta move to Alaska.
Right. So what was your reaction? Because as soon as it sort of became clear, shortly thereafter, that he was actually not seeing her anymore because he was attracted to her.
Mhm.
What was your initial reaction to the fact that he lied?
So before we jump into that,
Even before
I just
that,
wanna
yes.
discuss that discharge. So,
Yes, please. Yes.
can you imagine a therapist just being like, "Oh, by the way, this isn't working out. We're gonna have to stop
And this is
seeing
our
each
last
other."
session.
And
Yeah.
that's the statement. I can understand, like, it's perfectly common that a therapist will say, like, "So this will be our last session." That's a perfectly common thing, especially if somebody has reached the limits of their knowledge or their ability or whatever to be effective. That is definitely a conversation that can be had. However, you don't just go like, "Oh, yeah, sorry, like, I'm leaving you. I'm going to Alaska. Bye." It would be more
Yep.
of like a, um, usually like right off the bat at the beginning of the session. So I needed to let you know, like, I have been sent to Alaska and therefore I'll have to terminate with you today. How do you feel about that? What, like, and then
Right.
process it. But he literally is just like, "Peace out." And that's obviously wild. And then he like appears in a diner a little bit later and isn't in Alaska.
Well, right. And so obviously we have this problematic discharge, but
Yeah.
even if he was discharging her because he was attracted to her, which I guess is that's what the
That's
honest
what he
reason
claims.
was.
Yeah.
Um, there would have been other ways to communicate that, right?
Yes.
And I think, and obviously we're also leaving out that if he was actually discharging her, that there would have been conversations and work around. But since you're mandated, here is your referral to see someone else in this practice or some other solution. Like it would not be possible for her to literally just be left hanging,
No.
especially if she's mandated. Like there are all sorts of issues with that reality.
Yeah. Normally if it's mandated, it's like, here are your other referrals. If it's
That's
not
right.
mandated, it's, would you like me to give you other ones?
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was wild. But then to go to kind of what your original question was, this idea of him being attracted to her. Um, my immediate reaction, so the way that they present it, so he walks into this diner and she's like, "What? You lied to me. What's happening?" And he was like, "I couldn't keep seeing you because I was attracted to you." And that exact phrase, "because I was attracted to you," didn't sit well with me because that's not a
Yeah.
reason for a therapist to discharge with a patient. It's simply, in and of itself, it's simply not a reason. In the same way where a a therapist has motherly feelings for a child or feels like a friend to a patient, or I'm blanking on another example, but that type of like feeling emotionally intimate or feeling physically attracted to a patient is not enough to warrant having to terminate with a patient. Now, what is important is for that therapist to be checking in about those relational and emotional experiences. If they feel that it's kind of
Hmm.
questionable, their ability to kind of like maintain the appropriate boundaries and not let those feelings engage, like affect the therapeutic relationship, the first step is to get consultation about it. So what that means, you'll hear therapists use this phrase a lot, but basically what it means is talk to another professional who can kind of talk you through it and be like, let's get a third party look on this. Are you maintaining your boundaries? Can you continue to treat this person effectively? What is the damage of abandoning them? You know, do you talk to them about it? Do you not? Now, I don't know that a therapist would tell their patient that they're attracted to them. I can't see a situation where that would be therapeutically beneficial, but a situation where like I guess it's called countertransference could be discussed
Sure.
is where someone would say like, well, I noticed you pull these motherly feelings out of me. Like, I want to protect you like your mom. And sometimes that can say like, do you think you pull this out of other people? You know, and things like that. And it can help them explore their relationships outside of the room. But I've talked for a long time to kind of say that attraction in and of itself is simply not a reason unless that reason is getting in the way of the therapeutic relationship.
Right. So a lot of things might be happening behind the scenes of this sort of clinical example.
Mm-hmm.
We would hope that Kevin would have a supervisor that he would consult with over this decision.
Just imagine
You
just like
know,
2 sessions though.
sorry.
Just like 2 sessions. Like, oh God, I'm so in love with
Well,
her.
yeah.
I can't work with her anymore. It's like,
Yes.
whoa, I
Can't
think you need
possibly
a
see her again.
therapist about your own therapist to discuss immediate
Yeah,
infatuation.
it's and it becomes clear over the season, that he's got, maybe inadequacy issues or issues about his own mother and
Yeah.
and things like that. Um, but yeah, I'm with you on the sort of the value of communicating to Robin that this was the reason why he had to stop seeing her. Because think about her sort of psychological reaction to that.
Uh-huh.
I have romantic or physical attraction feelings towards you, and I had to never see you again. I mean, we talk about
Yeah.
narratives that are, painful and problematic in terms of how people, react to interpersonal circumstances. Like that would be a tough one.
Yeah.
And obviously Robin is disappointed by this outcome in the sense that, well, she wants to see him now. Like she started to form this good relationship with him,
Mhm.
knows that he's attracted to her, and more or less immediately suggests that they have a date, even though Kevin, I mean, he doesn't resist very much, but
Yeah.
he gives the sort of classical like ethically appropriate response of like, I saw you as a patient, you were vulnerable with me, it wouldn't be appropriate.
Mhm.
And the thing that struck me, it's almost funny with how little he like resisted the invitation, but she was just like, oh well, what's a date? What if we just sat down next to each
Yeah.
other and had a meal independently with each other?
Mhm.
And he's like, okay, you talked me into it. And it's
Yeah.
like, wow, your boundaries didn't really exist at all then.
Yeah, no. And also
Because
like
if that's all it took was
yeah.
like, yeah,
Yeah, well, and also like it that's also not appropriate, right?
right,
So if
exactly,
he was
yes.
ethically aware enough that he would end it after 2 sessions and being just like head over heels attracted to her, um, he would then know like if I can't maintain those ethical boundaries in the room, I'm certainly not going to maintain them in this diner. And so he would have been like, that sounds lovely. However, it is ethically inappropriate for me to do that. And I don't know about your like ethics board and your licensing board, but for ours, so the APA, it's 2 years is like the time difference between ending your therapeutic relationship and being allowed to have a different type of relationship with somebody. However, like
Hmm.
personally, like 2 years is not long enough. like like I worked with people 2 years ago that I still very much have like a therapeutic affection for them, and I'm like, you don't just get like rid of that in 2 years.
No.
And then the like secondary thing to that like ethical requirement is basically you have to be able to quote unquote prove that there is no longer this therapeutic power differential, which I don't necessarily know that that's totally possible to prove.
I was
And
going to say, how
how?
could we even be confident that that proof exists? Yeah.
Absolutely. And then also, particularly the way Kevin is presented in this friend group, it certainly would not disappear because they're constantly being like, oh, Kevin, the therapist, Kevin, the therapist,
Yep.
Kevin, the therapist. And so, like, it's constantly the center of his identity in this friend group, which means it has to be the center of identity. Maybe not the center of identity, but a large portion of his identity in Robin's brain, particularly since he was her therapist.
Right.
Yeah, wild.
And they try to acknowledge why it's unethical
Uh huh.
in like the initial stages of their relationship, where their intimacy is increasing and Robin is all of a sudden very uncomfortable, and we could understand
Hmm.
why. And
Hmm.
Kevin names it. It's like she's been vulnerable with him.
Hmm.
Not only that, but all of the friends are very appropriately being like, this is weird, this is wrong. Barney, who I think we both acknowledge is like a hugely problematic character 10 years later,
Yeah.
even calls it out as like, it's one thing to be a fake therapist and pretend to get
Uh-huh.
women this way, but to do it for real, bro,
That's
like
just
a
creepy.
step too far.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And everybody's like, oh my gosh, it's creepy. It's creepy. It's creepy. And I was sitting there being like, yeah, no, it's creepy. Like,
Yeah.
particularly like this again, I know I've brought this up a bunch, but like the speed with which that it was represented. And then also like what I really was annoyed by was they bring this up, right? And they make it pretty central for an episode of like, here's why dating your therapist is a problem. And
Yes.
then they quote unquote solve it by Robin being like, oh, that's fine. I'll just be your therapist for 2 hours. And basically, what she says to him is like, you owe me 2 hours of vulnerability. And like, great, but like, no. Like, it's simply not the same.
It's just a transaction. You just need to have the scales be rebalanced and then everything's fine. Is that not how it works?
Which, like, I do agree. I will often say to my patients, like, this isn't a friendship because if it was a friendship, you would be hearing about my stuff too, and that doesn't
That's right.
happen. However, like if I were to share with a patient, like, here's personal issues that came up for me, and that's why I had to miss the appointment. I'm thinking things that I might share would be like the passing or illness of a family member or something like that.
Sure. Yeah.
If I like shared that with a patient, that doesn't now make us friends. Like
Nope.
there's
Nope.
still this power differential, quite frankly, which like therapeutically we try to like limit that as much as possible. However, it still exists. One person is still paying another person, or the government is paying that person on your behalf. In Robin's case, probably, but although she probably has to pay for it herself. But yeah, it was they normalized it in this super weird way by being like, cool, we'll just reverse therapy you and then we'll be fine and it won't matter anymore. And then you can switch to
Yeah.
being just a therapist in our friend group rather than being Robin's therapist.
Yeah. And, you know, I think because I think what is problematic about it for me also is like this idea of vulnerability being something that is like unique to the therapist patient relationship.
Uh-huh.
And it's like, no, like if he was not a therapist, it would be normal relationship building for them to be vulnerable with each other. Why does it have to
Absolutely.
be like, oh, now I'm your therapist and you now open up to me about your mom in a very stereotypical way,
Mhm.
and then we're even, right? We're good. And it's like, well, I get what they're trying to say, but shouldn't these be conversations be happening whether he's a therapist or not? Like, aren't they supposed to be learning about each other? So it just feels so kind of twisted that, we're naming things like therapeutic or like as part of this specific relationship. Well, which obviously it is, but through the lens of this frankly unethical relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and then that switch to like him being the therapist in the friend group, there's a few
Yes.
moments where Robin has either these like flashbacks to childhood or these like suggestions of, I don't know, like mental health stuff or like personal struggles.
Yeah.
And he will make these like side comments of like, no, she's not crazy. And it's like, ugh, gross. Like you're still
Yep.
kind of keeping him as the person diagnosing her. Ew, stop it. Both in general as like a therapist in a friend group, but also it's doubly weird by the fact that like when he was her therapist, he acted like her friend, and now that he's her friend, he acts like her therapist. Like it's this, it can't be done. It can't be done like that. I'm sure there are places
No.
where it is done in an ethical way, but boy, seems wild.
Yeah. Super wild. And so it's hard, but sort of like, okay, if we accept that they dealt with the unethical nature
Yeah,
of this relationship and now it's just a therapist
sure.
dating a former patient, like
That's
that's a
kind of how
reality. And
they
look,
transition it too. Cool, we've
yeah.
accepted it. Let's move
And
on to the next
yeah,
portion.
great.
Yeah.
And look, I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that unfortunately this does happen in real life.
Mhm.
That doesn't make it good or okay or frankly funny on its own, but they
It
have to
is
kind of
Hollywood
like
fodder.
sitcomize it, which
Yeah.
is a word I just made up.
Laugh
And
track.
yeah, it's an ongoing challenge, and it sort of reminds me of a question that I had sent you that I saw in Quora, which is this idea, sort of more generally, like
Mhm.
about the sort of therapist patient like attachment piece, right?
Mhm.
And you were talking about this a little bit before of does a therapist just discharge their patient if they have feelings for them, or vice versa, right? If a patient fell in love or had feelings toward their therapist,
Mhm.
would that then result in a discharge? And obviously, there's no, to your point before, there's no one like hard and fast rule. I think it is something that has to be looked at in terms of how it is impacting the therapeutic
Yeah.
relationship. Would you say so? Yeah.
100%. And the link you sent me, the kind of main answer was this one person being like, no, 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 no. Absolutely do not discharge. This is exactly what you want so that you can work through it. And I'm like, okay, hold on. Whoa. I think any hard and fast rule like that is not beneficial because like maybe they become so focused on their attraction for the therapist that it actually stops the movement in therapy. And then it's not necessarily the most beneficial thing, right? It might be more beneficial to work with somebody else about your feelings for this therapist and how you got there,
Yep.
because sometimes the therapist themselves, being the object of the affection, cannot work. It's like when you're fighting with a partner and sometimes you're like, I need to just talk to my friend about it first so that I can then go back and talk to my partner about it,
Sure.
but in a therapeutic way, right? Like if you you're attracted to your therapist, sometimes your therapist isn't the right person to work that out with you, but sometimes they are. So I think it's fantastic for a person who has noticed that like their thoughts about their therapist, either romantically or in a friend way or something like that, um, when those kind of thoughts start to pop up more regularly, I think it's totally appropriate and also like therapeutically beneficial to tell your therapist. And then a really, I want to choose my words carefully, but a really like good therapist would be able to like work through that with you and wouldn't be freaked out by it and wouldn't be put off by it. Now, that being said, if you are bleeding into the territories of being a stalker or dangerous or aggressive or any of those things, then it also is their responsibility to end the relationship with you out of their own safety. But again, attraction itself, not a reason to discharge.
Yeah, and to sort of follow up on your point, like any feelings that you have
Yeah.
toward or against your therapist.
Particularly anger.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
is good stuff to share, important
Yeah.
stuff to share.
I love it when people are like,
Um,
"I'm kind of mad at you." I'm like, "Yes.
yeah,
Let's talk about what I
great.
did. Let's work through it." Yeah.
Right. And in a non-reactive, like totally supportive, like it's an important and a good thing that you told me this because
Yeah.
um that might offer the opportunity to kind of work on an interpersonal pattern that you don't get the opportunity to work on in your life otherwise.
Yeah.
So that's why there is no hard and fast rule per se. And that's why supervision and all these sorts of outlets for, let's make sure this is working, let's make sure this is appropriate, are taken throughout this, therapy process.
Mhm.
So yeah, and I also kind of wanted to take a step back in a broad sense because it's always wild to me when I'm watching a sitcom that plays through like heavy therapy and mental health themes because like sometimes obviously they nail certain things about what it's like to be a therapist or like tropes about passively analyzing your friend group.
Ugh.
Funny, no problem. But then there's stuff about it where I don't know if I'm like or like, and obviously the cringy with the unethical stuff because it just feels like that's sort of it's a trope, right? It's like
Mhm.
the therapist, as we've talked about, on sort of drama shows. It's like, oh, do they have a drug or alcohol problem?
Yeah.
Or, oh,
Or are they
are they
sleeping with their
sleeping with a
patient?
patient?
Yeah.
Or, oh, are they, what other kind of dual relationships can they have?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the part for me that is incredibly frustrating in this sense, so in How I Met Your Mother with Kevin, was they made him such a buzzkill. And they did it by having him be a therapist. And I was like, this sucks. So like basically anytime
Yeah.
they were doing any of their shenanigans, which I agree, like their shenanigans fall in like inappropriate patterns. However, like that's the show.
Yeah.
He would kind of come in and be like, here's why this is inappropriate, or I'm not going to say that you guys are being codependent and whatever now. And then there was one point where when Barney's trying to get them to let him take his ducky tie off, and they're all trying to like figure out like, should he trade it for slaps? Should they let him take it off? And then he comes in with this like, oh, well, I noticed that it's intriguing that suddenly you want to take it off now when you haven't wanted to take it off for weeks, which I think is a totally natural, clever observation for any person.
Yeah.
However, they like organized it around the fact that he was the therapist. Like the way that they
Right.
made
It's,
him
it's the
say it was like,
therapist as psychic or the
yes,
therapist as detective, right?
yes. Like
Yeah.
they were like, they made him say it like, here's my human behavioral observation rather than like,
Yep.
yo, dude, why now? You know?
Yep.
And I was
Mm-hmm.
just like so annoyed because I was like, this is the typical like perpetuating that therapists are analyzing you in social society. And like I've said before on this podcast and in life, is your accountant doing your taxes at dinner? Your therapist's also not doing therapy at dinner. Some do. But like I would argue that most do not.
Yeah, I think you nailed it because I think both of us are like it's such a tough thing because on one hand, I am glad anytime a show or a movie is like taking a stab at mental health representation and therapy representation. It's like yes, good. Let's get this as close to a normal thing as possible. But when in trying to make it normal, they also try to dramatize it or try to twist it or try to make it scandalous, then it's like, well, are we actually doing a disservice
Mhm.
to, what therapy is and what it's supposed to be as much as we are maybe normalizing? Because like I liked the episode when they're, oh, like this is what denial is, oh, this is what narcissism is, this is what codependence is. It's like, okay, that's
Yeah.
that's kind of cool. Like in a casual, funny, like, obviously all these characters are very much extreme versions of people,
Uh-huh.
so naturally it makes sense to apply certain types of analysis or diagnosis even to their circumstances.
But is it doing a disservice? Was that your question?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think so.
Um, yeah, I definitely think that it's doing a disservice to the idea of therapy. And I think that kind of ties back into the thing that I said earlier of how it's rare to have a character just join therapy. It's always this like punishment of some kind. And then we kind of portray therapists either as these like people who can't control themselves or as these like uber professionals who can't turn it off and aren't really are like somehow like ultra human and are like manipulative or um overly observant or kind of some kind of superpower. There's very seldom a representation of a person going to therapy with another person who's simply trained in the thing that they're doing. And I think I one thing that we've kind of suggested and hinted at is that this series did not age well at all. Like the
Right.
misogyny and some of the jokes are very awful. And I'm kind of wondering and hoping that like maybe our take on therapy has kind of grown a little bit because what continues to come to my mind is in the show This Is Us.
Yeah.
In This Is Us, one of the characters chooses to go to therapy, and it's like a good therapeutic relationship. And then he also chooses to change therapists, which is done really beautifully. And
Hmm.
I'm kind of hoping like that the more modern ones are like doing better with it and being more realistic with it, maybe because the way that we talk about therapy in general is more accessible and common. But I do think that the kind of way that like this talks about it is definitely a disservice. And then pairing it with like unethical
Yeah, and I do
choices.
think you're right. I know there are like better modern examples of it, and some of which we've covered on our show and some of which we hope to cover in the future. And I think it's okay that it's funny. It's okay that therapy and mental health stuff is funny. I would say it's even
Uh-huh.
important that it sometimes gets framed that
I
way.
agree.
But I think the thing I was coming back to was like, well, why couldn't they have an arc on a sitcom where, Robin goes into therapy and like learns how her, relationship with her dad affects the men she chooses or whatever.
Mhm.
Because and it's like, well, the problem is because sitcoms like characters don't change.
Mm.
Ted is Ted for 10 seasons.
Yeah. I I would disagree. And the only reason I
I
would is
mean, it's
because
not a hard and fast rule, but that's just like
but think about
sort of what
Barney,
feels.
right? So
Yeah, but yeah,
he starts
his
to
change
change when he
feels
starts
like.
dating Robin. Like seriously dating Robin.
Does he change though?
Yeah. I mean, they have these like conversations, like even in one of the episodes in this Kevin journey, Barney is able to like turn down this relationship with this beautiful woman because he realizes he's in love with Robin. And like, yes, that sends him into a spiral when Robin doesn't break up with Kevin.
Right, right.
But there is some growth there. I don't really remember how it ends because that the last season was just I blocked it out of my mind. Um, but I think there's some growth there, but I do agree with you. Like all the rest of them, there's like very like Ted stays Ted the whole time, annoying as he is. And then
Yep.
Marshall and Lily, like they are actually like a mostly healthy couple the whole time.
Yeah, oh totally.
Like that also doesn't change. So I think you're right. Like I think except for Barney becoming less repulsive, they don't really change.
Yeah, well, and to refresh your memory, like the way that this series ends is Barney has a kid. He's basically a single dad.
Mhm.
So like that part of him, I guess they try to frame as him sort of learning and growing.
Mhm.
But, other than being a dad, they still kind of frame him as like wanting to party and wanting to do all these things.
That's funny.
So I think that's sort of the interesting thing for me. And I guess, there are more complex shows where it can be funny and also sort of, let's say, closer to reality.
Yeah.
So, I think I'm just kind of hoping for that we get more of that.
I think like an episode where so they have the discussion where it's creepy that she's dating her therapist. I think they could have had an episode where they took his whole arc and put it into one, right? Where he's like psychoanalyzing them at
Yeah.
dinner and like diagnosing them and all these things. And then eventually her like their relationship ending because he's had his license taken away and et cetera, and then it like fell apart
Oh,
because of
yeah.
inappropriate, like that could still have been very funny because part of
100%.
this series and most series like comedy series, the relationships are these chaotic destructive relationships, and so that could have easily been represented in a more, I was going to say realistic, but in a more ethical way, I think, like being held ethically accountable way, because I unfortunately don't think that this is not realistic, but if we're going by like the expected standards.
Yeah, well, and I don't know if you remember this from watching the whole series, but the like flashback or flash forward when like the series end finally hits is like, oh, sort of catching up with these random characters. Kevin is again dating a patient, but
Oh,
it's like one of Ted's crazy exes.
oh, funny. Of course.
Yeah. So
He only dates Ted's exes.
yeah, so I guess it's like, okay, well, at least they're being consistent with like this is just the kind of maybe not so great unethical kind of
Yeah,
therapist
this
he
is what he
is.
does. Yeah. Jeez.
Yeah, sure. Which like, okay, at least they stuck with that pattern. But
Mhm.
man, it's just tough.
Yeah. Which in a drama would speak to a power differential trip. But
Yes, 100%.
this is
Yeah.
not a drama.
Yeah.
I think that they played it pretty funny, except for the fact that like there was one like therapist joke that I thought was very funny when Lily was like, "You watched an episode of Survivor without me," and they were like, "Survivor guilt," and I was like,
Yes.
"That's funny." But the other ones I felt like weren't like I didn't feel like his being a therapist added to the plot or comedy in any way.
Well, right. That's actually one of the things I wanted to ask you because there's the whole episode about like how, and this is like a very much like a therapy trope of like, oh, like you date your mom or you date your
Uh-huh.
dad. And that feels like the kind of thing that someone acting as a therapist might say. Because it's like, not that there's not a kernel of truth to it, but it's just like, oh, wow, they really are trying to hammer this like idea,
Yeah,
this God, what would you call it, like a therapy, almost like colloquialism or a therapy,
literally a trope.
a trope, yes,
Yeah.
and just sort of stretch it out to how it applies to every single character in the show.
Uh, I don't even know if I have a comment about that. Yep, that's a trope that they played
Well, do
out.
do you agree that people tend to date their parents?
Okay.
Should
Yeah,
we
I
go
can answer
there?
that. So I think that people tend to either look for values that align with theirs or fall into behavioral patterns that are comfortable. I
Right.
think those tend to be the two general paths that people take when they're not actively thinking about it. And so if what you're comfortable with or what you value is the relational patterns that you grew up with, then yeah, you're going to end up finding people who hold similar behavioral patterns to your parents. However, like I think that it's so much more complicated than that because, you know,
Right.
other relationships teach you what you like and don't like in relationships, whether that's friendships or teachers or therapists or romantic relationships or siblings, right? Whatever it is, those relationships also teach you what you want in life, what you are looking for, what you're not looking for, etc. And so, like, no, I don't think people always date their parents unless there's something about that relationship that's either comfortable or valuable or both.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So but that's not catchy enough for a sitcom episode.
No. And also it's not like Instagram worthy, Like I feel like a lot of these
Sure.
like takes on
Yep.
humanity, right? Are like they have to be like TikTok or Instagram worthy. Everyone who has ADHD looks like this, or everybody
Oh my
dates their
gosh, yeah.
parents, or everybody da da da. And quite frankly, it's like, well, no. A lot of people in today's world have ADHD symptoms because of how we engage with media, social media, and
Yep.
technology. Doesn't mean that you actually have it.
That's right.
But the like TikTok worthy nature of these broad but direct definitions, I think makes them more interesting. And I'm not saying it's a modern thing either, right? Because this idea of like you date your mom or you date your dad is
Oh, of
like
course.
it's so old,
Yeah,
right? It's like literally Freudian.
that's right.
But yeah, not as interesting to be like, well, there's more intricacies, and you'd have to know the
Well,
person
it's
deeper to
complicated,
know if
right?
they're actually codependent and like a
Yep,
30-minute TV show is like, no, we got to make the joke. So we're going to have Marshall making out with his dad,
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the sort of balance that we're hoping people, especially people in the media, people, whether it's in people on social media or people making media, are able to kind of walk a little bit more thoughtfully of, can we make this a little bit more, I almost said deep, but I think I liked your idea of like, well, no, couldn't we deal with a little bit more of the reality of Kevin's decision here,
Mhm.
right? Whether it's he would get his license revoked, or it would have sort of more direct and obvious impacts on their
Their
relationship.
relationship, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Like her feel like an easy joke to be able to play would be like they're having pillow talk and then afterwards she like feels like an urge to like pay him for it, or if they're having pillow talk and then
sure.
he goes, well, that's our time, and he like gets up to go make coffee. Like that would have been a really
Yeah,
easy way to play the same joke, but also like
yeah. So,
maintaining the
so what we're
realism.
saying is, writers of Hollywood, you should hire Haley and I to
Oh
help
my god,
help write your therapist scenes.
please, my goodness, dream come true.
That would be fun.
Oh
That would be a
gosh,
lot of
I
fun.
would love to be a writer in a writer's room.
Yeah.
So funny.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's staying into our souls now. See, your therapists are
Yeah.
people too.
That's right. Imagine that.
That's so funny.
It's a tough thing, it's a tough thing for us to break down, and we've sort of hinted at it, but the degree to which maybe we were entertained by some of this 10 years ago and today is probably quite different.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Particularly this show. Well, and also, like I was saying to you, like I'm currently watching How I Met Your Father, right? The updated version.
Mhm.
It's got a very similar and also very different vibe, which I think is clever because the way that it's different is way more modern. And I think it also does change it up when the central character is female rather than male,
Oh, sure. Yep.
particularly, 10 or so years later. I think that that's also an important aspect of it. I loved it when it was live and, I was watching it every week until the final season. I hated the final season. But yeah, watching it again today, I was like, oh, I don't feel good about these words that they're using.
Nope.
Yeah.
Not hardly at all.
No.
Yeah. Well, and that's, where we can look back and say, wow, well, we hope a lot of things have changed about the sort of things that we find entertaining. And hopefully we've learned about sort of, ways to helpfully and comedically portray issues of mental health. So with that, Haley, why don't we get into some
Yeah.
reviews of this How I Met Your Mother plot arc?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so on a scale of 5 staplers as trick-or-treater objects,
Nice.
objects, how accurate do you feel mental health, therapists, etc. were represented by this arc in season 7 of How I Met Your Mother?
So there were little bites that I liked in terms of like how accurate a initial, especially mandated therapy session might be.
Mm-hmm.
But and we're also acknowledging that yes, unfortunately, therapists have ended up in relationships with their patients. That's why these ethics rules exist, is because we've
Mm-hmm.
seen how bad it can go. But all that being said, like this is a sitcom on CBS that kind of happens in 24 minutes. So it's not very accurate. And I don't think people should be surprised that we would say that. So on a scale from 1 to 5, I would say, I will give the Kevin Robin arc an accuracy of like 2.4.
Oh my gosh, you're so much more generous than me.
Okay. I mean,
if you think 2 staplers plus a set of staples, you can give them that.
yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah, I guess that does feel generous. I'm sticking with it just because I wanna be consistent, but
I love that.
yeah, no, please rebut.
Yeah, I would give it a 1-ish.
Just a solid 1.
Yeah, like I feel like I'm not sure if I should take some staples out of the 1 or give a few extra staples to the 1. But yeah, I felt like the only things that were well represented were the him doing therapy in that first time that they meet. That's like the only thing I think that was done well. I don't think they represented a therapist well in a friend group. I don't think they represented how a therapy how a relationship after therapy would likely go well. They kind of never brought it up again. So I was like, I don't think they gave us enough good work. I did laugh that when he's painting the yellow room, the way that he's going about talking about them is very much what you and I do on this podcast. I was like, oh, that's me and Ryan on the podcast.
Well, yeah, and I think that's where my brain's going and sort of reviewing this is like that first session, which mostly felt like a therapy session, and then some of those little moments that just felt like kind of, I guess, close to home. But yeah, everything outside of that, I think you're right, is really problematic.
Yeah, because I would never do that with my friends. Like what I do on this podcast and what I do in the therapy room, I do not do out of these contexts. I'm only a psychologist when I'm psychologisting.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So in that case, let's think about how entertaining this is, and I will stress how entertaining it is today.
Okay.
Because that's when we're thinking about it and that's when we're watching it.
Yeah.
So on a scale of, let's see, 0 to 5, Weird Al Yankovic concert.
Okay.
Ooh. On a scale of 0, excuse me, let's try this again.
Try third time.
On a scale of 1 to 5, Weird Al Yankovic parody songs or concerts. Mm-hmm. How entertaining do you find How I Met Your Mother today?
I will give it a 3.75. I love the show. I think it's very quirky. I like the relationships. The characters, except for Ted, are really enjoyable. But it does not hold up, and it actually ruined it a lot for me because there are a lot of really misogynistic and thereabouts jokes, and I was disappointed every time one of those jokes was made, and unfortunately that's like entirely Barney's character. Not entirely Barney's character, but largely Barney's character. But then also, interestingly enough, like Ted and Robin and some of the other characters would also make comments within that regard as well, and I was just like, what is happening? Like, how was this only 10-ish years ago? Like, those kind of jokes feel so ancient. And so that truly made it less entertaining for me. But if you take if you add growth to it, like pretend that like they grew out of that and those jokes weren't there, I find it wonderful. I think the little quirks and tidbits are just really stupid, but in like a silly way. Like at the concert that they're at, not the Weird Al concert. They went to a concert just Ted and Marshall and Lillian, where Ted and Marshall just do like the circles between the women's room and their section. I just was like, this is so dumb, but like it was just so silly and enjoyable to watch what they did with it. But yeah, it doesn't hold up.
Yeah. I'm with you, and it's tough for me because this for a long time was like a comfort show, like very much like The Office or Scrubs. And now the more I watch these shows, and frankly, including The Office and Scrubs and How I
Mhm.
Met Your Mother, there's something that feels like it's changed. I don't know if I've changed or if we, the people, culture have changed, hopefully for the better. But certain things about some of these characters or the way we joke and the way we have like also like 20-25 minute sitcoms,
Mhm.
something feels like it's really shifted in whether it's like the types of characters that we root for or the types of things that we find funny, and something is not as comforting as it used to be, I have to say.
Mhm. Yeah, it's actually quite
Yeah.
uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, there were a lot of Barney jokes where I was sitting there being like, "I don't like that I'm participating in this show." Like, I, like, truly was just
Yep.
like, "I
Mhm.
don't wanna be here." Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Bummer.
and maybe that's okay. Maybe we learn from these shows, and maybe How I Met Your Father will do better.
Mhm. But it also speaks to how you and I have grown, right? So, like,
Yeah,
we both
totally.
have said that this
Yeah.
was a show that was meaningful to us 10 years ago.
Yep.
I always remember thinking that Barney was, like, inappropriate, but not to the extent that I feel now, which, like, thankfully, you and I have grown. Like, thank goodness this is
Well,
how
yeah,
change
yeah.
happens. This is how we we
Well,
as a
right, and
society
Barney
change.
used to be a character I felt like I could laugh at. Like, I wasn't laughing with him being misogynistic and sexist and all these sorts of things,
Uh
but I felt like I could laugh at him, like, "Oh, how ridiculous this character is." But
Totally.
now it's like, "Oh, no. It's
No,
it's
like, we were rolling our
worse
eyes
than
at
that."
him. Yeah, we were rolling our eyes at
Yeah.
him, and now it's like, "N no." Like, someone wrote this joke
Yep.
and thought it was funny.
Mhm. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think that's part of it too.
yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So, but that's okay. And it's a good thing that we're learning, and it's a good thing that our tastes are changing, right?
yeah,
If
thank
even if
goodness.
yeah, we should be evolving.
Yes.
So we will continue to look at sitcoms, I hope, because I think it's a good kind of reflection of like the moment of how we are thinking about and portraying culture as well.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
obviously we hope that mental health is a an appropriate part of like cultural discourse. So
yeah.
we here's hoping that it continues to be a positive one.
I hope so too. Awesome.
So with that, we are going to wrap up our episode for today. So thank you all so much for listening. As always, feel free to send us suggestions. We are always excited to do things that our audience suggests to us. So thank you always for those.
Yep. And follow us at PopPsych 101 on the socials, and we'll talk at you soon. Bye.
Bye.